Birmingham, Alabama, a sweltering April afternoon, with the heat rising to 85 degrees Fahrenheit from the asphalt like it wanted to scorch everything in sight. Inside the Silverstone Bank branch on 20th Street, the cool air from the air conditioning blew out, a stark contrast to the world outside. The large windows reflected the blinding sunlight, while inside, the hushed whispers of customers mingled with the clattering sounds of the money-counting machines. This is where the wealthy of the city come to safeguard their assets, a symbol of stability and power in this part of the American South. But today, everything is about to change. The heavy glass door of the bank creaked softly as a figure slowly stepped inside. It was Samuel Jackson, an elderly black man with a thin frame, his back slightly hunched from age. His clothes were tattered, the thick brown coat patched and frayed, stained as if it endured countless harsh winters. His old shoes were so worn that the soles were torn, revealing calloused toes. Over his shoulder, he carried a faded, heavy canvas bag that pulled his shoulder down at an angle. His unruly gray hair hung in disheveled curls over his weathered face, where deep wrinkles told the story of a life filled with struggle. As Samuel stepped through the doorway, the air in the bank seemed to pause for a moment. Curious eyes began to dart in his direction, from the sharply dressed customers in line to the bank employees in their dark blue uniforms. A middle-aged woman with shiny blonde hair, dressed in an expensive designer dress, subtly pulled her Gucci handbag closer to her light blue eyes flickering with mix of concern and disdain. "Who let him in here?" she whispered to the man beside her voice just loud enough for a few nearby to catch the words. Samuel didn't notice. He walked slowly, each step of his shoe scraping against the marble floor with a faint, squeaky sound. Every footfall seemed to carry an invisible weight, not from his frail body, but from something much deeper. He paused in the grand foyer, where the light from the crystal chandelier illuminated his face in the vast space. His deep, dark eyes scanned the crowd, calm yet resolute, as if he'd been preparing for this moment for a long time. Then he spoke up. Samuel's voice wasn't loud, but it was clear and confident, echoing in the quiet space of the bank. "This bank is mine," he said, each word dropping like a stone into a still pond. Silence enveloped the room for just a second before the entire bank lobby erupted in laughter. Laughter erupted from a corner near the service desk, where Nathan Cole, a young employee with light brown hair, was whispering to a co-worker. "Is this old guy crazy or what?" he said, trying to stifle his laughter, his eyes sparkling with mischief. The laughter spread quickly like wildfire across the dry grass, from the customers waiting in line to those lounging in the plush leather seating area. A middle-aged man, holding a Starbucks coffee cup, burst out laughing, spilling a bit of coffee on his crisp white shirt. "He must think this is a charity center or something," he shouted, causing a few others to laugh even harder. But not everyone is smiling. Lydia Brooks, a young trading clerk standing behind the counter, frowned slightly. She looked at Samuel, her big brown eyes filled with a hint of curiosity. There was something about this old man that made her uneasy, not madness, but strange confidence, as if he knew something that all of them didn't. Mark Thompson, the bank security guard, didn't share Lydia's curiosity. Standing at 6'2" with a muscular build in his black uniform, he strode in from the corner of the room, his polished leather shoes echoing sharply on the floor. Mark's face flushed with irritation as his large hand rested on the grip of his gun at his waist. "Hey, old man," he growled. "You're causing a scene here. Get out now, or I'll have to drag you out." Samuel didn't respond. He stood still, his eyes fixed straight ahead, showing no fear in the face of Mark's threat. The crowd began to murmur, a few people stepping back, waiting to see what would happen next. Laughter faded, replaced by a mix of curiosity and tension. Mark stepped closer, now just a few feet away from Samuel, his gaze icy. "Are you listening to me? I'm counting to 3. 1. But before Mark could count to 2, Samuel calmly raised his hand to the cloth bag slung over his shoulder. His movement was slow, almost ceremonial, as if he were about to unveil a secret that had been buried for far too long. The crowd held its breath, their eyes glued to the old man's trembling yet determined hands. Mark hesitated, his hand on the gun's grip loosening slightly, unsure whether to act or wait. The fabric bag rustled as Samuel pulled the drawstring. A corner of something old and faded peeked out from inside, yet held an odd allure. The murmurs in the crowd came to a complete stop. No more laughter, no more jeers. Just a heavy silence, thick with anticipation, as if the entire world was on the brink of a truth about to explode. The atmosphere in the main hall of Silverstone Bank in Birmingham, Alabama, seemed to thicken as Samuel Jackson slowly opened the old canvas bag slung over his shoulder. His hands, though trembling with age, moved with an uncanny precision, as if each gesture had been meticulously planned. The crowd stood frozen, no one daring to move, their eyes glued to the bag as if it were a Pandora's box about to unleash unimaginable secrets. Their breaths seemed to collectively slow down, merging with the rustling of the coarse fabric as the final tie was undone. Mark Thompson, the tall security guard, stood less than 5 feet away from Samuel, his hand still resting on the gun's grip. But now he didn't seem as intimidating as he had at first. His brown eyes narrowed, a hint of doubt mixed with curiosity. "What the hell are you doing?" Mark growled, his voice low but no longer certain. He shot a quick glance at the crowd, as if searching for support from the eager faces watching. But everyone remained silent, waiting. Samuel didn't respond right away. He bent down, slowly pulling out an old stack of papers from his pocket, the edges yellowed and tightly bound with a frayed piece of twine. As he lifted it up, the light from the crystal chandelier shone through, revealing faint words on the cover. The crowd murmured softly, but no one dared to speak up loudly. A man standing nearby, holding an iPhone, quickly raised his phone to record, whispering to the person next to him, "This is about to get interesting." "What is this?" Mark shouted, taking a step closer to Samuel, but his voice now carried more confusion than anger. Samuel looked up, his deep black eyes locking onto Mark's without a hint of fear. "This is the truth," he said, his tone deep and clear, like a hammer striking the silence. "The truth that this bank has buried for far too long." Samuel's words struck like a bolt of lightning across the bank lobby. The murmurs erupted once more, but this time it wasn't laughter laced with mockery. It was confusion, curiosity, and a hint of skepticism. Nathan Cole, the young clerk standing behind the counter, nudged Lydia Brooks with his shoulder and whispered, "Who does he think he is?" "A homeless guy claiming to own Silverstone Bank." Lydia didn't respond, her eyes still glued to Samuel, the unease in her heart growing stronger. There was something about this old man that wasn't madness. It was a quiet strength, like a smoldering fire beneath a layer of ash. Samuel set the stack of paper down on the marble floor, the soft thud breaking the silence in the room. He knelt on one knee, slowly untying the rope, revealing the pages inside an old ledger, its dark brown leather cover marred by the passage of time. On the cover, the words Silverstone Bank Ledger 1948 appeared faintly, yet still clear enough for anyone nearby to read. The crowd began to inch closer, a few people tiptoeing to get a better look, while Mark Thompson stood frozen, his hand on the gun's grip now hanging limply at his side. 1948? An elderly customer in a gray wool coat mumbled. "That's over 75 years ago. What the hell is he talking about?" But before anyone could react further, Samuel stood up straight, his voice ringing out once more, stronger than ever. "I am Samuel Jackson," he declared, "the man who laid the first brick for this bank. And I'm here to reclaim what's rightfully mine." The entire bank lobby fell into complete silence. No more laughter, no more whispers. Only the heavy breathing of the crowd as they tried to process what they had just heard. Mark Thompson stood there, mouth agape, his eyes wide in disbelief. "Why, what did you just say?" he stammered, his voice losing its aggressive edge for the first time that day. Samuel didn't repeat himself. He just stood there, his bony hands gripping the ledger tightly, his gaze sweeping over each face in the crowd. From the wealthy customers wearing expressions of confusion, to Nathan Cole, whose mouth hung open in shock, and Lydia Brooks, who now clenched her fists, her heart pounding with a powerful intuition. Then, as if to emphasize his words, Samuel bent down again, pulling out another item from the fabric bag. This time, it was a stack of old banknotes, each bill thicker than modern currency, faded in color, but still bearing the logo of Silverstone Bank, a symbol that no one at the bank had ever seen, as it had been changed over half a century ago. He let the stack of money fall to the floor, each bill quietly touching the ground, like pieces of forgotten story. The crowd held its breath. Mark Thompson took a step back, his hand trembling as if it just touched something he shouldn't have. Lydia Brooks whispered to herself, "Oh my God, is this really happening?" Meanwhile, Nathan Cole shook his head, but his gaze couldn't tear away from the pile of money and the ledger on the floor. In that moment, no one knew what would happen next. But everyone felt one thing. Samuel Jackson was not just an ordinary old man wandering the streets. He was a mystery, a storm quietly brewing, and what he carried in that old, tattered bag could shake Silverstone Bank, and perhaps all of Birmingham, forever. The light from a crystal chandelier in the main hall of Silverstone Bank in Birmingham, Alabama, still sparkled on the marble floor, but the atmosphere was no longer filled with curiosity mixed with mockery like just a few minutes ago. A pile of old banknotes with a Silverstone Bank logo from 1948 lay scattered at Samuel Jackson's feet, next to the dark brown leather ledger he had just set down. The crowd of customers and bank employees stood frozen, their eyes wavering between shock and disbelief. Their heavy breaths seemed to blend with the heartbeat of someone trying to grasp what had just happened. Samuel stood tall, his thin shoulders beneath a tattered coat no longer slumped because the fabric bag was now empty. He didn't say anything more after the shocking announcement that he was the founder of this bank. His deep, dark eyes scanned the crowd, calm yet sharp, like an old soldier accustomed to battles that no one else could see. Mark Thompson, the 6'2" security guard, still stood about 5 feet away from Samuel. But the initial aggression he had shown was now replaced by a clear look of confusion. His hand was no longer resting on the gun's grip, but hung loosely at his side, as if he wasn't sure who he was facing. "W, what did you just say?" Mark repeated, his voice trembling. Tried to regain his tough demeanor, but failing. He glanced over at the crowd, hoping someone would break the strange silence, but no one spoke up. From the corner of the counter, Nathan Cole, the young employee with light brown hair, leaned over and whispered to Lydia Brooks, "This old guy is really out of his mind. Who would believe such a ridiculous story?" Lydia didn't respond. She stood still, her hands gripping the edge of the counter, her big brown eyes fixed on Samuel. There was something about this old man that made her unable to laugh it off like Nathan. The determination in his gaze, the way he stood firm against the scornful looks. It didn't seem like the behavior of a madman, but rather that of someone who had carried this secret for decades. The crowd began to murmur again, but this time it was filled with whispers of doubt rather than laughter. A middle-aged woman, clutching her Gucci bag tightly, turned to the man beside her, her voice trembling. "Does he really think he owns this place? I mean, just look at him. He looks like a homeless guy." The man, holding a now-cold cup of Starbucks coffee, shrugged. "Probably a scam. But that pile of cash, it sure looks old." Samuel seemed not to hear the whispers around him. He took a small step toward the ledger on the floor, his old shoes creaking on the marble. His slow movements felt like a silent challenge, showing he wasn't afraid, not shaken by the eyes fixed on him. He bent down, picked up the ledger, and cradled it against his chest like a treasured possession. "I didn't come here to beg," he said, his voice deep yet resonant. "I came to reclaim what is rightfully mine." The words hit like a cold wind sweeping through the bank lobby, causing the crowd to freeze once more. Mark Thompson stepped forward, this time quicker, his polished leather shoes echoing with decisive footsteps. "That's enough, old man," he shouted, his voice rising in frustration. "Do you really think you can walk in here, throw around this nonsense, and demand to own the bank? Get out right now, or I'll call the cops." But Samuel was unwavering. He lifted his head, looking straight at Mark, his eyes shining in a strange way, not with anger, but with an unshakable determination. "You can call whoever you want," he said slowly, "but the truth doesn't change just because you don't believe it." His words were gentle yet sharp, slicing through Mark's arrogant facade like a knife. The guard froze, his mouth opening to retort, but he couldn't find the words to respond. From behind the counter, Lydia Brooks felt her heart racing. She didn't understand why, but Samuel's voice, his calmness amid the storm of criticism, filled her with an unexpected sense of respect. She glanced at Nathan, who was still shaking his head with a mocking expression. "Don't you find it strange," she whispered. He's not scared. Not scared at all. Nathan shrugged. Maybe he's out of options. Who wouldn't be scared when someone threatens to call the cops? But Lydia wasn't so sure. She looked at Samuel, seeing the way he stood there, clutching the notebook like a shield, and she began to wonder if what he was saying could really be true. In the crowd, an older man in a gray wool coat stepped forward a few paces, his voice trembling with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "Hey, who do you say you are? Samuel Jackson? And this bank has been yours since 1948? I've lived in Birmingham my whole life, and I've never heard of this." Samuel turned to Man, his gaze softening slightly, yet still holding on to its resolve. "Because they've erased my name from everything," he said, his voice heavy with sadness. "They took away all my names, my hard work, and even the dreams I once had, but I haven't forgotten. And today, I'm going to make them remember." Those words hit like a stone thrown into a pond, sending ripples through everyone's mind. A few customers began to step back, unsure whether to trust or to fear. The woman clutching her Gucci bag whispered, "What if he's telling the truth? What if this bank?" But she didn't dare finish her sentence, her anxious eyes darting around as if afraid someone might overhear. Mark Thompson, now regaining some composure, stepped closer to Samuel, just 2 feet away. "I don't care what you have to say," he growled. "You're causing trouble here, and I won't stand for it. Get out right now, or I'll drag you out by the collar." But Samuel stood firm, his hands tightly clutching the ledger, his gaze locked on Mark. "You can drag me away," he said, his voice steady yet powerful, "but you can't drag the truth away with me." At that moment, the atmosphere in Silverstone Bank grew heavier than ever. The crowd fell silent, waiting, feeling as if a storm was approaching, and Samuel Jackson, the frail old man in tattered clothes, was at the center of it all. Samuel Jackson just walked into Silverstone Bank with an unshakable spirit, facing the disdainful glares and threats from Mark Thompson. His determination is the first spark of hope, and now it's time for us to rally behind him. Please comment Samuel Strong in the comments to support Samuel Jackson. Just a few short words from you can spread his strength to everyone. Together, we will keep this story alive. The main hall of Silverstone Bank in Birmingham, Alabama, now drowned in a heavy silence, only broken by the ragged breaths of the crowd and the sound of Mark Thompson's leather shoes echoing on the marble floor. The 6-foot, 2 security guards stood less than 2 feet away from Samuel Jackson, his face flushed with anger and confusion. Samuel's last words, "You can't drag the truth along with me," hung in the air like a challenge that no one dared to respond to immediately. Mark clenched his fist tightly, his nails digging into his palm as if trying to suppress the rising tide of rage. "You think you're so clever, old man?" he spat, his voice rising to a pitch that was almost shattering. "Don't test me. I gave you a chance to walk away peacefully, but that's over now." He raised his hand, pointing directly at Samuel's face, his finger trembling with a loss of control. "I'm calling the cops right now, and you're in jail for causing a disturbance." But Samuel didn't blink. He stood there, his bony hands gripping the brown leather ledger tightly, his deep black eyes staring straight into Mark's as if piercing through the guard's aggressive facade. "Go ahead, call them," he said, his voice low and steady, without a hint of wavering. "Call the police. Call whoever you want. But when they get here, they'll have to look at this." He lifted the ledger a little higher, "and they'll see what you're trying to hide." The words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. He took a half step back, his brown eyes wide with a hint of confusion. The crowd began to murmur again, whispers spreading like ripples in water. An older man in a gray wool coat mumbled, "Is he telling the truth? That book, it looks really old." A woman clutching a Gucci bag turned to the person next to her, her voice trembling. "What if he really is proof? This is just insane." From the ticket counter, Lydia Brooks felt her heart pounding. She couldn't take her eyes off Samuel, his strange resolve in the midst of the storm of criticism and threats. She turned to Nathan Cole, who stood beside her with a look of half-belief, half-doubt. "Can't you see it, Nathan?" she whispered, her voice low but urgent. "He's not afraid of Mark. Not afraid of anything. A normal person wouldn't act like this." Nathan shrugged, but this time he wasn't mocking anymore. "Maybe he's just good at playing a part," he said, But his gaze was fixed on the stack of old bills on the floor, as if he were wondering whether they really were from 1948. Anyway, Mark will take care of him. No one dares to stir up trouble around here for long. But Lydia wasn't so sure. She looked at Samuel, seeing how he stood firm like an old oak tree in a strong wind, and she began to sense that something bigger was happening, a story that they had only just begun to scratch the surface of. Mark Thompson, now regaining some composure, stepped closer, just a foot away from Samuel. He leaned down, face to face with the old man, hot breath escaping from his nose. "Listen here," he growled. "I don't care what that ledger is or who you think you are. This is Silverstone Bank, not a stage for your little antics. I'm counting to 3, and if you don't walk out on your own, I'll drag you out by your collar." He started counting, his voice ringing out like an alarm bell. 1. Samuel stood still. He remained motionless, his worn-out shoes lightly scuffing the floor, his gaze locked firmly on Mark. 2. The crowd held its breath. A few people stepped back, fearing that things were about to spiral out of control. The woman clutching her Gucci bag covered her mouth, her eyes wide open, while the man holding a Starbucks cup whispered, "Oh, God! Please don't let there be a fight here. Dad!" Mark raised his hand, ready to grab Samuel by the collar, but in that instant, the old man lifted the ledger up to his chest like a shield. His movement was quicker than anyone expected, and Mark froze, his hand hovering in midair. "You touch me," Samuel said, his voice deep yet sharp as a knife, "and you'll have to explain to the whole world why you're too afraid to face the truth in here." Mark came to a halt, his hand trembling in the air. The crowd was dead silent, no one daring to breathe loudly. Lydia Brooks clenched her fists, feeling like her heart was about to leap out of her chest. Nathan Cole whispered, "What the hell is going on? What did he just do?" Samuel lowered the ledger, resting it back against his chest, his gaze fixed on Mark. "I didn't come here to cause trouble," he said, his voice softening yet still powerful. "I came here because I've waited over 75 years to say this. And I'm not going anywhere until you all hear me." The words washed over the bank lobby like an invisible wave. Mark took a step back, for the first time that day looking completely lost. The crowd began to stir, a few people moving closer, curiosity overcoming their fear. The man in the gray wool coat mumbled, 75 years? How old is he anyway? Lydia Brooks felt a jolt of electricity run down her spine. She looked at Samuel, noticing the deep lines etched into his face, his tousled gray hair, and his eyes that carried a century of both pain and resilience. "He's not lying," she whispered to herself, her voice so soft that Nathan couldn't hear. "He believes it, completely believes it." Mark Thompson took a deep breath, trying to regain his fierce demeanor. "You wanted to listen?" He growled, but his confidence was wavering. "Fine, but if your truth is nonsense, I swear I'll make you regret stepping foot in here." Samuel smiled faintly, the first smile he had worn since entering the bank. It wasn't a triumphant grin, but rather the smile of someone who had endured too much to still feel fear. "Go ahead, try it," he said, his voice light as a breeze, yet strong enough to send a chill through the entire bank lobby. The atmosphere now is not just heavy. It's thick with a sense of unease. Samuel Jackson, the frail old man in tattered clothes, is not just a troublemaking drifter. He is a living mystery, a flame that no one can extinguish, and his story, whether true or not, is starting to shake the seemingly impenetrable walls of Silverstone Bank. The main hall of Silverstone Bank in Birmingham, Alabama, was no longer a place filled with mocking laughter or shallow curiosity as Samuel Jackson walked in. The atmosphere was heavy, like a storm about to break, with every gaze in the crowd, from wealthy customers to bank employees, fixed on a frail old man standing on the marble floor. A pile of worn-out bills from 1948 lay scattered at his feet, and a dark brown leather ledger was clutched tightly against his chest like a shield. Samuel's final challenge, "Go ahead, try it," echoed in Mark Thompson's mind. The tall security guard frozen in place, his hands trembling, unsure whether to act or hold back. Mark took a deep breath, trying to regain his fierce demeanor. "All right, old man," he growled, his voice high-pitched but no longer as confident as before. "You wanted to listen? Then go ahead and speak." But if your truth is nonsense, I swear I'll make you regret stepping foot in here." He crossed his arms, his brown eyes narrowing, as if daring Samuel to prove his words. Samuel smiled faintly, a smile not born of triumph, but someone who has carried pain for far too long to still be afraid. He gently placed a ledger on the floor, right next to a stack of old bills, then stood up straight, his thin shoulders no longer hunched beneath the tattered coat. The crowd held its breath, feeling as if time was slowing down. Lydia Brooks, standing behind the counter, clenched her fists, her heart pounding. Nathan Cole beside her whispered, "This is about to get crazy, I bet." But this time his tone was no longer mocking. It was filled with curiosity. Samuel cleared his throat, his deep black eyes scanning the crowd, from Mark Thompson to the murmuring customers, finally landing on the woman clutching her Gucci bag, now covering her mouth with a look of bewilderment. "I am Samuel Jackson," he began, his voice low yet clear, echoing in the vast space of the bank. "In 1948, I laid the first brick for this Silverstone Bank. I poured my sweat, blood, and even my dreams into every stone, every dollar to build it into what you see today." The entire bank lobby fell into absolute silence. A few people stood with their mouths agape, unable to believe what they had just heard. The man in the gray wool coat muttered, 1948? How old is he now? But Samuel didn't stop. He raised his hand and pointed down to the ledger on the floor, his voice beginning to tremble, not out of fear, but from the overwhelming emotions of memories buried for far too long. This ledger is proof. It records everything, my name, my signature, and the days I spent with Thomas Reed, who was once my friend, building this bank from the ground up. The name Thomas Reed struck the air like a bolt of lightning. A few older customers nodded slightly, as if that name stirred something from Birmingham's distant past. Lydia Brooks whispered to Nathan, "Thomas Reed, I feel like I've heard that name somewhere before." Nathan shrugged, but his gaze remained fixed on Samuel, as if he were trying to piece together a puzzle. Samuel bent down, picked up the big notebook, and opened it with trembling hands but full of determination. He flipped to the first page, where the faded black ink handwriting stood out clearly under the chandelier's light. "Here," he said, holding the notebook up for everyone to see. "March 15th, 1948, Thomas Reed and I signed a contract to establish Silverstone Bank. I put in $500, every penny I saved from 10 years of working at the lumber mill, to buy this piece of land. I personally carried every bag of cement, every brick, to build the bank you're standing in right now." The crowd began to stir. The man holding a Starbucks cup muttered, $500 in 1948? That's a fortune." The woman clutching a Gucci bag took a step back, her light blue eyes wide with disbelief. "No way," she whispered. "A guy like him, how could he?" But Samuel paid no mind to the murmurs. He turned to the next page, where his signature and Thomas Reed's lay side by side, as clear as yesterday. "Thomas Reed is my friend," Samuel continued, his voice now heavy with sorrow, as if each word was a cut to his heart. "We dreamed together of a bank that wasn't just a place to hold money, but a beacon of hope for Birmingham, for people like me, black folks who have been turned away by society. But Thomas changed." He paused, taking a deep breath, his eyes shut tight as if to hold back the pain. "He couldn't stand the thought of a black man like me standing on equal ground with him. He betrayed me." The atmosphere in the bank became suffocating. Mark Thompson, standing 5 feet away from Samuel, crossed his arms, but his gaze was no longer aggressive. It was filled with suspicion. "Sell you out?" he asked, his voice low but unable to hide his curiosity. "What do you mean?" Samuel opened his eyes, his gaze now sharp as a knife. "Thomas Reed colluded with the Crawford family," he said, his voice rising, filled with fury. "They were the wealthiest in Birmingham at the time, landowners, factory owners, and wielders of power. They didn't want a black man like me owning anything, let alone a bank. So Thomas forged documents, erased my name from everything, and handed control over to the Crawford family. They stole Silverstone Bank right out from under me, all because of the color of my skin." The entire bank lobby erupted in whispers. The name Crawford hung in the air like a ticking time bomb, causing a few older folks to nod slowly, as if they were recalling something from the city's old tales. Lydia Brooks leaned in and whispered to Nathan, "The Crawford family, they're still wealthy in Birmingham to this day. If he's telling the truth." Nathan didn't respond, but this time he didn't shrug it off either. His gaze was fixated on the ledger in Samuel's hands, as if it held the key to a much bigger mystery. Samuel raised the ledger high, his voice now trembling with emotion. "They took away all my dreams, my hard work, and my reputation. They erased me from history, as if I never existed. But I haven't forgotten. I've kept this ledger, kept this money," he pointed down to the stack of old bills on the floor, "for over 75 years, waiting for the day I could stand here and tell you the truth." The crowd fell silent, but the atmosphere was no longer one of doubt. It was filled with shock and unease. Mark Thompson took a step back, his hand trembling. Lydia Brooks felt her eyes sting, not understanding why tears were welling up. The man in the gray wool coat murmured, "Oh, God, if this is real." Samuel lowered the ledger, clutching it tightly to his chest, his eyes igniting with a fire that no one could extinguish. "I didn't come here to beg," he said, his voice stronger than ever. "I came to reclaim what's rightfully mine, and I won't leave until you all face this truth." In that moment, Silverstone Bank was no longer just an ordinary bank. It had become a battleground of a buried history, and Samuel Jackson was the one digging it up piece by piece. The main hall of Silverstone Bank in Birmingham, Alabama, now felt like a pressure cooker ready to explode. Samuel Jackson's final declaration, "I won't go anywhere until you face this truth," hung in the air, heavy like a curse that no one dared to break. A pile of old bills from 1948 lay scattered across the marble floor, and the brown leather ledger in the frail old man's hands was no longer just evidence. It was a smoldering fire, threatening to burn down everything the crowd in the bank once believed in. Mark Thompson, the 6'2" security guard, stood about 5 feet away from Samuel, his arms crossed tightly over his chest as if to hide the rising confusion within him. He cleared his throat, trying to regain the fierce demeanor he had lost. "Are you done talking, old man?" he growled, but the confidence in his voice was now just a thin veneer. "What do you think those old papers prove? I bet you picked them out of trash somewhere and made up this ridiculous story." But Samuel didn't respond with anger. He calmly placed the ledger back down on the floor next to the stack of cash, then stood up straight, his deep black eyes locking onto Mark's. "You don't have to believe me," he said, his voice low but sharp as a knife. "But you can't deny what's right in front of you. This money, this ledger, they're not trash. They're history, and history doesn't lie." The crowd began to stir, whispers spreading like ripples in water. The man in the gray wool coat stepped forward, his voice trembling with a mix of curiosity and doubt. "Wait, are you saying the Crawford family robbed your bank? You mean the Crawford family from Birmingham? The ones who own the steel mill and half this town?" He shook his head as if he couldn't believe it. "They've been the most powerful family here since before I was born. How could they—" Samuel turned to the man, his gaze softening just a bit, but still holding on to his resolve. "Because they can," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "They have money, they have power, and they have the backing of society that doesn't want to see a black man like me succeed. Thomas Reed sold me to them for $2,000, a steal in exchange for an entire bank." He paused, took a deep breath, his frail hands clenching into fists. "They've made me invisible, erased my name from all the documents, and turned Silverstone Bank into their own." The atmosphere in the bank grew more suffocating than ever. Lydia Brooks, standing behind the counter, felt her heart pounding. She turned to Nathan Cole, whispering urgently, "Nathan, did you hear what he said? $2,000 in 1948, that's a fortune. If he's telling the truth." Nathan didn't respond right away, his gaze fixed intently on the stack of cash on the floor, then shifting to the ledger. "If it's true," he muttered, "then this whole bank is a lie." From the corner of the room, the woman clutching her Gucci bag took a step back, her light blue eyes wide with confusion. "No way," she whispered to the man holding a Starbucks cup beside her. "The Crawfords are the backbone of Birmingham. They can't be doing something like this, right?" The man shrugged, his voice dropping. "I don't know. But just look at that pile of cash. It doesn't look fake. Samuel picked up an old bill, holding it high under the glow of the chandelier. The bill was thicker than modern currency. Its colors faded, but the Silverstone Bank logo, a triangle with a stylized S, was still clearly visible in the corner. "These were the first bills I printed for this bank," he said, his voice now trembling with emotion. "I designed this logo myself, personally checked every single note. But after Thomas and the Crawford family kicked me out, they changed everything. The logo, the paperwork, even the history. They turned me into a ghost." The crowd fell silent, but the air was now thick with a deep sense of unease. Mark Thompson took a step back, his hands trembling. "Why, you're making this up," he stammered, but his voice lacked any convincing power. "How can you prove it?" "Just with a few bills and an old notebook." Samuel lowered the bill, placed it back on the floor, and picked up the ledger again. He flipped to a page near the end, where the faded black ink handwriting was now clearly visible. "Here," he said, holding the ledger up for Mark and the crowd to see. "October 12th, 1949. Thomas Reed signed a contract transferring Silverstone Bank to the Crawford family. But my signature isn't here. They forged the documents, kicked me out of the very bank I built, and made it theirs." The entire bank lobby erupted in whispers once again, but this time it was shock and outrage. The man in the gray wool coat muttered, "Oh my God! If this is true, then the Crawford family—" He didn't dare finish his sentence, but his eyes conveyed everything. The doubt that had now shifted into a glimmer of hope that Samuel might actually be right. Lydia Brooks felt her eyes welling up. She didn't understand why, but Samuel's story, the pain, the injustice, and his resilience, was touching a deep part of her heart. She turned to Nathan, her voice trembling. "Can you see it? He's not lying. He can't be making this up." Nathan nodded slowly, for the first time that day not arguing back. I don't know anymore," he whispered. "But if the Crawford family really did this—" Samuel raised the ledger high, his voice now powerful like thunder. "They've taken everything from me," he said, each word striking the silence like a hammer. "They've used money and power to erase me from history, to make me a nonentity. But I've held on to these," he pointed to the stack of cash in the ledger, "for over 75 years, waiting for the day I could stand here and tell you the truth. And now, I want you to look at it. Look at what they've done to me, to all of us." The atmosphere in Silverstone Bank was now not only heavy, but also filled with a sense of outrage and shock. Mark Thompson stood frozen, his hands hanging limply at his sides, his gaze flickering between the ledger and Samuel's weathered face. Lydia Brooks quickly wiped away a tear, while Nathan Cole clenched his fists as if he were trying to hold back an unexpected surge of anger. The man held his Starbucks cup and muttered, "If he's telling the truth, then this bank, all of us, we've been living a lie." The woman clutched her Gucci bag, covering her mouth, her eyes wide with fear. "The Crawford family won't let this go," she whispered. "If this is real, then everything is going to fall apart." Samuel stood there, clutching the notebook tightly to his chest, his eyes glowing with fire that no one could extinguish. He didn't say anything more, but everyone felt that his story was not just an accusation. It was a ticking time bomb, and Silverstone Bank would never be the same again. The main hall of Silverstone Bank in Birmingham, Alabama, is no longer a peaceful place for transactions. It has turned into a battlefield, where the historical truth that Samuel Jackson has just unveiled about being robbed of the bank by Thomas Reed and the Crawford family in 1948 is shaking everything to its core. Old bills with the Silverstone Bank logo from over 75 years ago are scattered across the marble floor, and the brown leather ledger in the hands of the frail old man is the spark that ignited a storm of emotions. A crowd of customers and employees stands frozen, their eyes flickering between shock, outrage, and fear, while the atmosphere is as heavy as a pressure cooker about to explode. Samuel stood in the center, his hands tightly clutching the ledger, his deep, dark eyes ignited with fire that no one could extinguish. His last words, "I want you to see what they have done to me, to all of us," still echoed in everyone's minds like a call to action that couldn't be ignored. But not everyone was ready to face that truth. Mark Thompson, a 6'2" security guard, stood about 5 feet away from Samuel, his arms no longer crossed but clenched into tight fists. His face was flushed, not just from anger, but from a rising sense of helplessness. "Enough!" he shouted, his voice reaching a pitch that was almost breaking, echoing throughout the bank lobby. "You think you can just walk in here, throw around this garbage, and cause chaos in the bank? I don't care what you say, you're a liar, and I'm going to prove it." Mark stepped forward, his polished leather shoes echoing with decisive footsteps on the floor. He stopped just 2 feet away from Samuel, bending down to face the old man. His hot breath billowed from his nose, and his brown eyes narrowed with hostility. "You want the truth?" he growled. "The truth is, you don't belong here. You're a drifter, a madman, and I won't let you ruin this place." But before Mark could do anything else, a voice rang out from behind the counter, slicing through the tense atmosphere like a knife. "Mark, stop." It was Daniel Harper, the branch manager of Silverstone Bank, a man in his 40s with neatly styled light blonde hair and pale blue eyes that always seemed to radiate caution. He stepped out from the office in the back, his polished black dress shoes echoing steadily on the floor. Daniel stood 5'10", with a slender build that carried a quiet authority. He wore a dark gray suit, his green tie tightly knotted, but now his hands trembled, as if he had just stepped into a situation that was spiraling out of control. "Mark," he repeated, his voice low yet firm. "Stay calm. Don't do anything rash." Mark turned back, his eyes blazing with anger and disappointment. "Calm down," he shouted, pointing at Samuel. "He's ruining everything, Daniel. He's calling the Crawford family, the ones who own this bank, thieves. You want me to just stand by and let him keep going?" Daniel didn't respond right away. He stepped closer, stopping about 10 feet from Samuel, his light blue eyes scanning the old man, then drifting down to the stack of cash and the ledger on the floor. He took a deep breath, trying to maintain the calm demeanor of a manager, but the unease within him was as clear as day. "Mr. Jackson," he said, his voice gentle yet filled with suspicion, "I don't know where you got these things, but you have to understand that what you're saying, it can't be true. Silverstone Bank has belonged to the Crawford family since I was a child. I've read every historical document about this bank, and there's no name Samuel Jackson in any of them." Samuel looked at Daniel, his gaze unwavering. "Because they erased me," he said, his voice deep yet powerful. "They erased my name, erased my efforts, and turned me into a nobody. But I have proof," he lifted the ledger, "and you can't deny what's right in front of you." Daniel shook his head, his hands clenched into fists. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising with tension. "The Crawfords aren't just bankers. They are Birmingham. They own steel mills, hotels, and even the city council. If you're telling the truth, then you're accusing one of the most powerful families in Alabama of a crime. Do you have any idea what kind of consequences that would bring?" Samuel smiled faintly, the smile of someone who has lost too much to still be afraid. "I know," he said, his voice steady. "I know better than you think. I've lived with the consequences for 75 years, lost everything, erased, forgotten. But today, I'm not afraid anymore. I'm here to reclaim what's mine, no matter what the Crawford family does." The atmosphere in the bank grew more suffocating than ever. Lydia Brooks, standing behind the counter, felt her heart pounding. She turned to Nathan Cole and whispered, "Daniel looks terrified. Do you see it? He knows something." Nathan nodded slowly, his gaze shifting between Samuel and Daniel. "If the Crawford family is involved in this," he muttered, "we're in big trouble." Mark Thompson couldn't take it anymore. He stepped forward, just 1 foot away from Samuel, and suddenly pulled out a handgun from his waistband. The metallic clink echoed in the silent space, causing the crowd to scream in horror. The woman clutching her Gucci bag stepped back, covering her mouth, while the man holding a Starbucks cup dropped at the floor, coffee splattering everywhere. "I've had enough," Mark shouted, raising the gun to Samuel's chest, his finger trembling on the trigger. "Shut your mouth right now, or I swear I'll shoot. If your heart is racing with the courage of Samuel, an old man standing up to a gun to defend the truth, then show some love for this video and hit that subscribe button for legendary narratives right now. Together, let's keep the flame of justice burning bright, just like he has for 75 years. The entire bank lobby held its breath. Lydia Brooks screamed, "Mark, no!" but her voice was drowned out by the panicked whispers of the crowd. A few customers ran toward the door, but most stood frozen, their eyes wide with fear. Daniel Harper raised his hand, his voice breaking with panic. "Mark, put the gun down. Right now." But Mark wouldn't listen. His eyes were bloodshot, his breath coming in quick gasps. "Can't you see it, Daniel?" he growled, the gun still aimed at Samuel. "He's ruining everything. If we let him keep going, the Crawford family will destroy all our work, our lives. I won't let that happen." Samuel stood still, not blinking in front of the gun barrel less than 2 feet from his chest. His hand still clutched the ledger tightly, his gaze locked onto Mark, showing no fear. "You can shoot me," he said, his voice deep and strangely calm, "but you can't kill the truth. It will survive whether I'm here or not." The word struck Mark like a knife. He trembled, his finger tightening on the trigger, but he didn't pull the shot. The crowd fell silent, no one daring to breathe too loudly. Lydia Brooks covered her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks, while Nathan Cole clenched his fists, whispering, "Oh, God, don't let this happen." Daniel Harper stepped closer, just 3 feet away from Mark, his voice trembling yet filled with determination. "Mark, lower your gun," he said, each word sounding like a plea. "We can't resolve this like this. If Mr. Jackson has evidence, we need to consider it. Lower your gun. I'm ordering you." Mark turned back to look at Daniel, his eyes wavering between anger and confusion. "You're siding with him?" he stammered, the gun still aimed at Samuel. "Don't you see? If the Crawford family finds out about this, we're done for." Daniel took a deep breath, his light blue eyes locked onto Mark. "I'm not on anyone's side," he said, his voice low but firm. "I'm on the side of the truth. And if we don't face it, we're the ones who are done for." At that moment, Silverstone Bank was on the brink of an explosion. Not just a gunshot, but the collapse of a history buried for far too long. Everything depended on Mark, on his trembling finger on the trigger, and on the decision that Daniel Harper had to make right now. The main hall of Silverstone Bank in Birmingham, Alabama, now felt like a ticking time bomb, just waiting for a tiny spark to set everything off. Mark Thompson, the 6'2" security guard, stood less than 2 feet away from Samuel Jackson, his handgun aimed directly at the frail old man's chest. His finger trembled on the trigger, his brown eyes blazing with anger and confusion. Daniel Harper's last words, "If we don't face the truth, we're the ones who are truly finished," hung in the air like a final thread holding everything back from the abyss. The crowd of customers and staff stood frozen, no one daring to breathe too loudly. Lydia Brooks, from behind the counter, covered her mouth to stifle a sob, tears streaming down her cheeks. Nathan Cole, beside her, clenched his fist and whispered, "Oh, God, don't let him shoot." The woman clutching a Gucci bag pressed herself against the wall, her light blue eyes wide with fear, while the man holding a Starbucks cup stood frozen, coffee spilling all over the floor, forgotten and untouched. Mark turned back to look at Daniel, the gun in his hand trembling slightly, but still aimed at Samuel. "What did you say?" he growled, his voice breaking with rage. "You're siding with the truth? The truth of this crazy old man? Can't you see, Daniel? If the Crawford family finds out about this, they will destroy us. My job, your job, everyone's here. All will go up in smoke." Daniel Harper stood 3 feet away from Mark, taking a deep breath, his hands trembling, but his light blue eyes sharper than ever. He stepped closer, now just a foot away from Mark, his voice low yet as firm as steel. "Mark," he said, each word hitting like a hammer, "put the gun down. This is my command. If you shoot Mr. Jackson, you won't just destroy him, but all of us. Do you want the Crawford family to win? This is exactly how they'll turn us into the villains, and the truth will be buried forever." Mark's heart raced as his finger tightened on the trigger, but his gaze flickered between Daniel and Samuel. "You don't understand," he stammered, his voice dropping in confusion. "They won't let us go. They will—" But he couldn't finish his sentence, as Samuel, who remained standing still in front of the gun, suddenly spoke up. "You're afraid of them," Samuel said, his voice low and oddly calm, as if the gun less than 2 feet from his chest was nothing. "You're afraid of the Crawford family, afraid of their power. I get it. I was scared too. 75 years ago, when they took everything from me. But I learned one thing. Fear doesn't change the truth. It only makes you their slave. The words hit Mark like a punch to the face. He froze, the gun in his hand lowering slightly, but his fingers still rested on the trigger. The crowd held its breath, feeling as if time had slowed down. Lydia Brooks whispered to Nathan, He's not afraid to die? Do you see that? Nathan nodded slowly, his gaze locked onto Samuel, as if for the first time he was truly seeing this old man. Daniel Harper seized that moment. He took a step closer to Mark, almost right beside him, and placed a hand on his shoulder. Mark, he said, his tone softening yet still powerful, put the gun down. We're not enemies here. If Mr. Jackson is telling the truth, we need to examine his evidence. Otherwise, we're no different from the Crawford family, hiding the truth with violence. Mark ran up, his eyes darting between Daniel and Samuel, then down to the gun in his hand. He took a deep breath, his breath coming in quick gasps like someone who had just run 10 miles. You don't understand, he murmured, his voice dropping almost a whisper. If we do this, the Crawford family won't forgive us. They'll destroy us. Me, you, everyone here. Daniel tightened his grip on Mark's shoulder, his gaze locked on the security guard. Maybe, he said, his voice low but firm. But if we don't do this, we'll destroy ourselves. Do you want to live your whole life knowing you shot an innocent person just to protect a lie? Those words struck like a final knife into Mark's pride. He trembled, the gun in his hand slowly lowering, his fingers slipping off the trigger. The crowd let out a collective sigh, whispers spreading gently like ripples in water. Mark stepped back a foot, 3 feet away from Samuel, then gradually holstered his weapon, his hand shaking as if he had just escaped a nightmare. I don't want this, he murmured, his voice breaking. But if you're wrong, Daniel, then we're all done for. Daniel nodded slowly, his gaze shifting to Samuel. I hope I'm not wrong, he said, his voice low but filled with determination. He stepped closer to the old man, just 5 feet away, and bent down to pick up an old bill from the floor. He held it up, examining the faded Silverstone Bank logo under the chandelier light, then turned to Samuel. Mr. Jackson, he said, his tone softening, if you have real evidence, I'll consider it. But you have to understand that this isn't simple. The Crawford family won't back down, and I'm not sure I can protect you or anyone hear from them. Samuel looked at Daniel, his eyes lighting up with a flicker of hope for the first time since he stepped into the bank. I don't need you to protect me, he said, his voice deep yet warm. I just need you to face the truth. That's all I want after 75 years of living in the dark. The atmosphere in the bank began to cool down, but it was still thick with a sense of tension and unease. Lydia Brooks wiped away her tears and whispered to Nathan, Daniel is doing the right thing. I know it. Nathan nodded, his gaze still fixed on the bill in Daniel's hand. Maybe, he said, his voice low, but if the Crawford family reacts, this is just the beginning. From the corner of the room, the man in the gray wool coat muttered, I can't believe this. If he's telling the truth, then all of Birmingham will be shaken. The woman clutching her Gucci bag whispered to the person next to her, the Crawford family won't let this slide easily. They'll do whatever it takes to bury it. Daniel Harper held the crumpled bill in his hand, his gaze shifting between it and Samuel. He took a deep breath, then turned to the crowd, his voice ringing out clearly in the vast space. Everyone, please stay calm, he said, trying to maintain the authority of a manager. I don't know where this will lead, but I promise to look into Mr. Jackson's evidence. We can't rush to conclusions, but we also can't ignore it. Samuel nodded slowly, holding the notebook close to his chest. Thank you, he said, his voice low but filled with emotion. That's all I need, an opportunity for the truth to be heard. Mark Thompson stood a few steps away, his hands hanging loosely at his sides, his gaze empty like a man who had just lost a battle. He didn't say a word, but his silence spoke volumes. He was no longer a threat, at least not for now. The crowd began to murmur again, but this time it was out of curiosity and hope rather than fear. Lydia Brooks smiled faintly and whispered to Nathan. He did it. He got them to listen. Nathan nodded, his eyes lighting up a bit. Maybe, he said, but the Crawford family won't let this go. This isn't over yet. Daniel Harper stood in the lobby, an old bill in his hand. His gaze locked onto Samuel. He knew that his recent decision to stop Mark from shooting and promise to review the evidence had put him on an irreversible path. The Crawford family would soon find out, and that's when the real pressure would begin. But in this moment, he felt something strange, a glimmer of hope that the truth, no matter how painful, was still worth fighting for. Silverstone Bank is no longer just a bank. It's a place where history and the present collide, and all eyes are on Daniel Harper, the man who must decide whether Samuel Jackson's truth is worth risking everything. The main lobby of Silverstone Bank in Birmingham, Alabama, had just gone through an emotional storm that no one present could have ever imagined. Mark Thompson, the 6'2" security guard, now had his gun resting quietly in its holster at his waist, his hands hanging limply at his sides, his gaze vacant like a man who had just lost a battle. Daniel Harper, the branch manager, stood about 5 feet away from Samuel Jackson, holding an old bill from 1948, the faded Silverstone Bank logo glimmering under the chandelier's light. His promise to review Samuel's evidence still echoed in the air, like a tiny beacon amidst a fog of doubt and fear. Samuel stood still in the center, his bony hands tightly clutching a brown leather-bound ledger, his deep black eyes shining with a flicker of hope for the first time since he walked into the bank. The old bills scattered across the marble floor were no longer a subject of mockery. They were pieces of buried history, now brought back to light by this old man. The crowd of customers and staff remained silent, but the atmosphere was no longer suffocating with tension. Instead, it was filled with a lingering sense of curiosity and unease. Daniel Harper took a deep breath, his light blue eyes scanning the crowd before landing on Samuel. "Mr. Jackson," he said, his voice low but firm, "I don't know where this will lead. The Crawford family is a powerful force, stronger than anyone in this room. But I promise you, I will look into the ledger and the money. If you're telling the truth, I will do what's right." Samuel nodded slowly, his cracked, dry lips curling into a smile. Not a triumphant grin, but a smile of a man who has just found light after 75 years of living in darkness. "Thank you, son," he said, his voice deep and warm. "That's all I needed, a chance for the truth to be heard." He bent down, picked up an old bill from the floor, and gently smoothed it out with his trembling hands, as if it were a precious keepsake from a life long gone. Mark Thompson stood a few steps away, his gaze still vacant, but now devoid of any aggression. He stepped back another 3 feet, leaning against the wall, as if he wanted to disappear from everyone's sight. "If you're wrong, Daniel," he murmured, his voice so low that almost no one could hear, "we're all done for." But Daniel didn't respond. He knew Mark was right. The Crawford family wouldn't let this go, but he also knew there was no turning back now. From behind the counter, Lydia Brooks quickly wiped away the tears on her cheek, her big brown eyes lighting up with a glimmer of hope. She turned to Nathan Cole and whispered, "Daniel did it. He stopped Mark, and now he's on Mr. Jackson's side. Do you see that?" Nathan nodded slowly, his gaze fixed intently on the bill in Daniel's hand. "I see," he said, his voice low. "But the Crawford family won't let this slide easily. We're heading into a real mess here." But Lydia didn't let Nathan's warning dim the light in her heart. She stepped out from behind the counter, her high heels clicking softly on the marble floor. The crowd murmured, their eyes turning toward her, a young, petite clerk who had never stood out in any situation before. She stopped about 10 feet away from Samuel, her hands trembling but her gaze steady. "Mr. Jackson," Lydia said, her voice soft yet clear, echoing in the quiet space of the bank. "I believe you. What you say, what you bring here, I believe it's the truth." She bent down, picked up an old bill from the floor, holding it with both hands like it was a precious item. Then she stepped closer, just 5 feet away from Samuel, and placed the bill on the small table nearby, right in front of him. That action was like a stone thrown into a still pond, sending ripples through everyone's hearts. Samuel looked at Lydia, his eyes lighting up with a spark of emotion that wasn't surprise, but deep gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice low yet trembling with emotion. "You have no idea what this means to me after all these years." Daniel Harper turned to Lydia, his light blue eyes wide with surprise. "Lydia," he said, his voice low but filled with gratitude, "you don't have to do this. This? But Lydia interrupted him, her gaze locked firmly on Daniel. I have to, she said, her voice now stronger. If we don't stand up now, then when? Mr. Jackson has fought his whole life to be heard. I can't just stand by any more. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, but this time it was filled with curiosity and admiration instead of doubt. The man in the gray wool coat muttered, That girl is really brave. If she believes him, the woman clutching her Gucci bag whispered to the person next to her, Maybe he's telling the truth. Maybe the Crawford family. But she didn't dare finish her sentence, her anxious eyes darting around. Nathan Cole stood behind the counter, looking at Lydia with a mix of surprise and embarrassment. He took a deep breath, then suddenly stepped out, his sneakers making slow, deliberate sounds on the floor. The crowd began to murmur again, their eyes all turning toward him. Nathan stopped about 8 feet away from Samuel, bent down to pick up an old bill, and then moved closer, placing on the table next to Lydia's money. I'm sorry, Nathan said, his voice trembling but sincere, his gaze lowered, unable to meet Samuel's eyes. At first, I didn't believe you. I thought you were crazy. But now, I'm not so sure anymore. If you're telling the truth, then I want to stand by your side. Samuel looked at Nathan, his eyes lighting up with a deep sense of emotion. Thank you, kid, he said, his voice low and warm. You have no idea what that means to an old man like me. The atmosphere in Silverstone Bank was no longer suffocatingly tense. Instead, a fragile sense of hope was spreading. Daniel Harper looked at Lydia and Nathan, then turned to Samuel, his eyes lighting up with a newfound determination. If they believe you, he said, his voice low but steady, then I will believe you too. I'll review your evidence, no matter what the Crawford family does. We will face this together. Samuel nodded, holding the notebook tightly against his chest, his eyes lighting up with a faith he had lost long ago. Thank you all, he said, his voice trembling with emotion. After 75 years, I'm no longer alone. The crowd began to murmur again, but this time it was filled with admiration and hope. Lydia Brooks offered a faint smile, her eyes locking with Samuel's, and she knew she had just done the right thing. Nathan Cole stood beside her, his gaze still downcast, but his shoulders were straighter, as if he had just shed a heavy burden. Daniel Harper stood in the lobby, an old bill in his hand, his gaze locked onto Samuel. He knew the Crawford family would react soon, and the pressure would weigh heavily on all of them. But in this moment, he felt a new strength, the strength of unity, of those willing to stand up for truth, no matter the cost. Silverstone Bank is no longer just a battleground. It had become a place where a moral turning point has just occurred, and this fragile unity could be the first glimmer of hope in a long fight ahead. The main lobby of Silverstone Bank in Birmingham, Alabama, was no longer suffocating with tension as it had been just moments ago. Mark Thompson's gun had been holstered, and the 6-foot, 2 security guard now leaned against the wall, about 10 feet away from Samuel Jackson, his gaze vacant like someone who had just lost their way. Daniel Harper, the branch manager, stood at the center, holding an old bill from 1948, his light blue eyes shining with newfound determination. Lydia Brooks and Nathan Cole stood near a small table, where 2 old bills were neatly placed, a symbol of the first support for Samuel. Samuel Jackson, the frail old man in the patched-up coat, clutched a brown leather-bound notebook tightly to his chest. His deep, dark eyes were not just resolute anymore. They now sparkled with a newfound hope. His final words, after 75 years, I'm no longer alone, floated through the bank lobby like a warm breeze, easing the heavy atmosphere just a bit. The pile of old bills scattered on the marble floor was no longer something to scoff at. Instead, they were pieces of a story that was slowly being embraced. Daniel Harper turned to the crowd, taking a deep breath to regain the authoritative presence of a manager. Everyone, he said, his voice ringing clearly in the vast space. Listen to me. I don't know where this will lead, but I promise you and Mr. Jackson that I will look into everything he brings here. We will uncover the truth, no matter how difficult it may be. He held up the old bill, the chandelier light shining through it, making the Silverstone Bank logo sparkle. If he's telling the truth, then we can't turn our backs on this. The crowd murmured, But this time it was a mix of agreement and admiration. The man in the gray wool coat nodded slowly, mumbling, "If he has real evidence, then the Crawford family will have to answer." The woman clutching her Gucci bag, though still looking worried, whispered to the person next to her, "I didn't expect this to be so serious. Maybe he's not crazy." Lydia Brooks stepped closer to Daniel, just 3 feet away, her big brown eyes shining with a fierce belief. "Daniel," she said, her voice soft yet steady, "you're not alone. I'll help you no matter what the Crawford family does. Mr. Jackson deserves to be heard, and we can't let him fight this battle alone anymore." She turned to Samuel, offering a faint smile. "I believe in you, and I will stand by your side." Samuel looked at Lydia, his eyes shining with a deep emotion. "You are a brave person," he said, his voice low and warm. "I've waited too long to hear someone say that. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart." Nathan Cole stood next to Lydia, his gaze still lowered, but his shoulders were straighter now, as if he'd just discovered a strength he didn't know he had. "Me too," he said, his voice trembling but sincere. "I'm not good at saying I'm sorry, but I was wrong not to believe you at first, Mr. Jackson. If Daniel is looking at the evidence, then I want to help too." Daniel looked at Lydia and Nathan, then turned to Samuel, his eyes lighting up with newfound confidence. "It seems like you've got a little team here, Mr. Jackson," he said, his voice low, but carrying a rare hint of humor. "I don't know how much we can accomplish before the Crawford family, but at least you're not alone anymore." Samuel nodded, hugging the notebook tighter, his eyes lighting up with a hope he had long lost. "You have no idea what this means to me," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. 75 years is a long time to wait, but today I feel like I just found something I thought I'd lost forever." The atmosphere in the bank was now filled with a fragile yet powerful sense of unity. The crowd began to relax, with a few people stepping closer, their curious and admiring gazes replacing the initial skepticism. An elderly customer, wearing a striped shirt, mumbled, "If they can do this, maybe that old man is telling the truth. I've never seen anyone so determined." Mark Thompson, still leaning against the wall, gazed at the scene before him with a complex expression. He didn't say a word, but his hands were no longer trembling. The initial aggression had faded, replaced by an incomprehensible silence, as if he were wrestling with himself, unsure whether to continue resisting or to accept what was happening. Daniel Harper placed the old bill down on the table, next to the 2 bills that Lydia and Nathan had put down, then turned to the crowd. "I'm going to need some time to consider everything," he said, his voice more confident than before. "But I want you all to know that I'm not doing this alone. Mr. Jackson has us, me, Lydia, and Nathan, and I hope you all will also consider standing on the side of the truth, no matter how difficult it may be." Lydia nodded, her eyes meeting Daniel's before shifting to Samuel. "We can do this," she said, her voice soft yet filled with determination. "No matter what the Crawfords do, we won't let them bury this story again." Nathan shrugged, but this time it was a light shrug, accompanied by a faint smile. "I'm not really good at heroics," he said, "but if Lydia's in, then I can't just stand by. Mr. Jackson, I hope you're right, because if not, we're going to be in big trouble." Samuel smiled, the first genuine smile to grace his weathered face since he walked into the bank. "I'm right," he said, his voice deep yet filled with strength. "And with all of you here, I know we can achieve something I haven't dared to dream of for the past 75 years. The crowd murmured louder, but this time it was filled with support and hope. The man in the gray wool coat mumbled, "They're really doing this. If he has the evidence, the Crawford family will have to face it." The woman clutching her Gucci bag whispered, "I don't know, but I'm starting to believe him." Daniel Harper stood in the lobby, his gaze locked onto Samuel, then shifting to Lydia and Nathan. He knew that the Crawford family would soon find out, and when they did, the pressure would weigh down on all of them like a tidal wave. But in this moment, he felt a newfound strength not just from within himself, but from the unexpected unity of those around Mr. Jackson. Silverstone Bank is no longer just a place of conflict. It had become a turning point of conscience, where ordinary people like Lydia and Nathan choose to stand up, and where Daniel Harper realizes that the truth, no matter how frightening, is still worth fighting for. The conflict may have cooled down, but everyone knows that the real battle with Crawford family has only just begun, And this time, Samuel Jackson is not alone. The main hall of Silverstone Bank in Birmingham, Alabama, is no longer a place filled with angry shouts or sharp suspicion like it once was. The light from the crystal chandelier still shines down on the marble floor, but the atmosphere has shifted. It's no longer suffocating with tension, but instead filled with profound silence, as if everyone has just crossed a threshold they never thought they could. Samuel Jackson, the frail old man in the patched coat, stands at the center, clutching a brown leather ledger tightly in his hands, his deep black eyes shining with faith he lost over 75 years ago. Old bills from 1948 still lay scattered on the floor, but now no one dares to mock them anymore. 3 crisp notes are neatly placed on a small table nearby, a testament to the support from Lydia Brooks, Nathan Cole, and Daniel Harper, like little flames igniting a greater hope. The crowd of customers and employees stands still. Their gaze is no longer filled with contempt or fear, but with admiration mixed with curiosity, waiting to see how this story will unfold. Daniel Harper, the branch manager standing at 5 feet 10 inches, was about 5 feet away from Samuel, still holding the old bill he had picked up earlier. He took a deep breath, his light blue eyes scanning the crowd before landing on Samuel. "Mr. Jackson," he said, his voice deep yet firm, "I don't know what the Crawford family will do when they hear about this. But I promise you, Lydia and Nathan, and I will not let you fight this battle alone anymore. We will bring your evidence to light, no matter what the cost." Samuel looked at Daniel, then turned to Lydia and Nathan, his eyes shining with a deep emotion. "You've given me more than I ever dared to dream," he said, his voice trembling with feeling. 75 years is a long time to wait, to be forgotten, to be erased. But today, I feel like I've found myself again. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart. He bent down, picked up another old bill from the floor, gently brushed it with his shaking hands, and placed it on the table next to the others, as a final affirmation that he would not give up. Lydia Brooks stepped closer to Samuel, just 3 feet away, her big brown eyes shining with a fierce belief. "You don't need to thank us," she said, her voice soft yet warm. "We're the ones who should be thanking you for showing us that the truth is worth fighting for, no matter how tough it gets." She offered a faint smile, her gaze locking with Samuel's, and in that moment, they both felt a connection that transcended their age difference, a thread of courage and hope. Nathan Cole stood next to Lydia, his gaze no longer cast down, but lifted to meet Samuel's with newfound respect. "I'm not great at this emotional stuff," he said, his voice low but sincere, "but you've made me rethink a lot of things today. If you're right, and I start to believe you are, then I'll do everything I can to help you." He shrugged, offering a rare, faint smile. "Anyway, the Crawford family might be wealthy, but they can't buy all of us, right?" Samuel smiled, the first genuine smile to break through the hard lines of his face since he stepped into the bank. "That's right, young man," he said, his voice deep yet filled with strength. "They can buy land, they can buy power, but they can't buy trust or truth. And today, I see both of those right here." The crowd began to murmur, but this time it was filled with agreement and admiration. The man in the gray wool coat nodded slowly, mumbling to the person next to him. "This old guy is something special. I've never seen anyone so determined." The woman clutching her Gucci bag, still looking worried, whispered, "If they really stand up against the Crawford family, maybe he's not as crazy as I thought." Mark Thompson, still leaning against the wall 10 feet away, watched the scene before him with a complicated expression. He didn't say a word, but his hands were no longer trembling. The initial aggression had faded, replaced by an unsettling silence as if he were wrestling with himself, unsure whether to stay on the sidelines or step into something bigger. Daniel Harper placed the old bill down on the table, standing tall, his gaze locked onto Samuel. "I'll need some time to go over the ledger and these bills," he said, his voice ringing clearly in the bank lobby. "But I want you to know that I'm not doing this just for you. I'm doing it for all of us, because if you're telling the truth, then this Silverstone Bank isn't just the Crawford family's property. It's a part of history that we all have the right to know." Samuel nodded, his eyes lighting up with a fierce belief. "You're a good man, Daniel," he said, his voice deep yet warm. "I've waited 75 years to hear someone say that, and today I leave here with the hope that the truth finally has a chance to be heard. He gently set the ledger down on the table next to Bill's, then walked toward the front door, his old shoes creaking on the marble floor. The crowd automatically parted, creating a path for Samuel. No one said a word, but their eyes, from Lydia, Nathan, to the customers like the man in the gray wool coat, shone with respect. Lydia stepped forward, placing her hand on Samuel's shoulder as he walked by, whispering, "You're not alone anymore. We'll carry on for you." Samuel nodded, his eyes glistening with emotion, but he didn't say anything more, as if every word had already been spoken through their actions. As Samuel approached the heavy glass door, he paused, turning back to take one last look at the bank lobby. The evening light streamed through the glass, illuminating his weathered face, highlighting the deep wrinkles that marked a life filled with struggles yet never defeated. "Thank you all," he said, his voice deep and resonant, "for giving me this chance, the chance to stand tall one last time." Then he pushed the door open and stepped outside, the soft golden sunlight enveloping his frail figure like a halo. The door clicked shut behind him with gentle sound, but no one in the bank lobby felt it was an ending. They knew that Samuel Jackson had just achieved a victory not through money or power, but through the indomitable spirit of a man who had fought his entire life to be recognized. Daniel Harper stood in the lobby, his gaze following Samuel through the glass until he disappeared from sight. He turned to Lydia and Nathan, his voice low but filled with determination. "We're not done yet," he said. "The Crawford family will react, and when they do, we need to be ready. But today we did something right, and I'm proud of that." Lydia nodded, her eyes shining. "We can do this," she said, her voice steady. "For Mr. Jackson and for ourselves." Nathan shrugged, a faint smile on his face. "I don't know if I'm a hero," he said, "but if he can stand strong for 75 years, then I can at least give a shot." The crowd began to disperse, but their eyes remained fixed on the small table where the ledger and the old bills lay still, the undeniable evidence of a truth that couldn't be ignored. The man in the gray wool coat muttered, "He didn't just beat the bank, he won our hearts." Mark Thompson, still leaning against the wall, finally stepped away for his spot and slowly walked toward the door without saying a word. But his gaze, though complicated, was no longer one of hostility, as if Mr. Jackson had left him with a question he couldn't quite answer. Daniel, Lydia, and Nathan stood still in the hallway, their eyes locked onto each other before shifting to the small table where Samuel's evidence lay quietly. They knew the Crawford family would soon find out, and a bigger battle was looming ahead. But in this moment, they felt a new sense of hope, a hope that the truth, no matter how long it had been buried, could still prevail. Silverstone Bank is no longer just a building. It's the place where Samuel Jackson reclaims his honor, and where a new chapter, a chapter of justice and courage, has just begun. The heavy glass door of Silverstone Bank in Birmingham, Alabama, closed behind Samuel Jackson with a soft click, leaving the main hall in a profound silence. The late afternoon sun streamed to the large windows, casting light on the marble floor where a pile of old bills from 1948 lay scattered, the last remnants of a story that had been buried for over 75 years. The brown leather ledger and 3 old bills on the small table nearby were no longer just evidence. They had become a symbol of a spiritual victory won by the frail old man in the patched coat. Daniel Harper, the branch manager standing at 5'10", stood in the lobby, his light blue eyes still following Samuel's figure as it faded into the soft golden light outside. Lydia Brooks and Nathan Cole stood beside him, their eyes shining with newfound belief, though a hint of worry lingered about what was to come. The crowd of customers had begun to disperse, but no one left without glancing back at the small table where Samuel's evidence lay still, as if they had just witnessed something greater than themselves. Daniel turned to Lydia and Nathan, taking a deep breath to regain his composure. "We just did something," he said, his voice low but steady. "Something I never thought I'd do in my 15 years of managing here. Mr. Jackson has changed everything, not just for him, but for all of us." He placed his hand on the table, his fingers lightly brushing against the ledger, as if he wanted to feel the weight of the history it carried. Lydia nodded, her big brown eyes shining with a quiet pride. "He didn't just reclaim his dignity," she said, her voice soft yet filled with emotion. "He showed us that the truth can survive no matter how long it's been buried. I've never met anyone like him, someone willing to stand up after 75 years just to be heard." She turned to look through the glass, where Samuel had disappeared, and smiled faintly. "He's a hero, not the kind you see in movies, but a real one." Nathan Cole shrugged, but this time it wasn't a casual gesture. It was a thoughtful shrug. "I don't know if he's a hero or not," he said, his voice low but sincere, "but he definitely makes me feel small. I laughed at him at first, thinking he was crazy. Now, I just hope I have even a fraction of his courage when facing the Crawford family." He looked down at his sneakers, then lifted his gaze, his eyes shining brighter than usual. Daniel smiled faintly, a rare smile for the day. "We're going to need more than just a bit of courage," he said, his voice low but tinged with drama. "The Crawford family isn't going to let this slide easily. They have money, power, and a whole team of lawyers ready to bury us under piles of paperwork. But Mr. Jackson has given us something they don't have, a reason to fight." He held up a ledger, the chandelier light shining through, highlighting the faded words. "This isn't just his story. It's the story of what's right, and we have to carry it on." The atmosphere in the bank lobby was now thick with profound sense of gravity, as if everyone stood at a crossroads in history. The crowd had nearly dispersed, but a few lingered, their eyes shining with curiosity and admiration. The man in the gray wool coat, now standing near the door, muttered to himself, "If that old man is telling the truth, then Birmingham will never be the same again. The Crawford family might be wealthy, but they can't erase what we just witnessed." From the outside, news about the incident at Silverstone Bank began to spread like a small fire in the wind. A few customers pulled out their phones to record Samuel telling his story, and those short videos quickly made their way onto social media, from Twitter to Facebook, spreading throughout Birmingham in just a few hours. Hashtags like #SilverstoneTruth and #SamuelJackson started popping up, accompanied by comments ranging from skepticism to support. One person wrote, "If he has proof, the Crawford family is finished." Another replied, "This is Birmingham. Money and power always win. But I hope he's right." Daniel, Lydia, and Nathan were unaware of the undercurrents forming outside, but they could feel the weight of what had just happened. Daniel set the ledger down on the table, his gaze locked onto Lydia and Nathan. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice low but filled with determination, "I'm taking this to the board. I know they won't want to hear that the Crawford family has someone on the council, but I won't back down. We're going to bring Mr. Jackson's story to light, no matter how long it takes." Lydia nodded, her eyes lighting up. "I'll help you," she said, her voice steady. "I can look up old records in the system for anything that's left from 1948. If Mr. Jackson is telling the truth, there has to be a trace somewhere." She turned to Nathan, giving a faint smile. "Are you in?" Nathan shrugged, a faint smile on his face. "I'm not great with paperwork," he said, "but I can do something to keep an eye on social media, see what people are saying. If this gets out, the Crawford family will have to respond, and we need to know what they're going to do." Daniel nodded, his eyes lighting up with newfound belief. "Good," he said. "We're a team not just because of Mr. Jackson, but because of ourselves. If we don't stand up now, then when?" He looked through the glass window, where the evening sunlight was fading, and whispered, "He's done the hardest part. Now it's our turn." The atmosphere in Silverstone Bank now carries not just silence, but profound sense of purpose. Samuel Jackson may have left, but his story, one of perseverance, of truth standing against injustice, has left an indelible mark. It's not just a journey of an old man reclaiming a bank. It has become a beacon of inspiration, spreading from this bank's lobby all across Birmingham and beyond. In the days that followed, news about Samuel Jackson and Silverstone Bank spread, capturing the attention of the local press. An article in the Birmingham News stated, "A 95-year-old man claims he is a forgotten founder of Silverstone Bank, and he has the proof." The community began sharing his story, from those who had worked with Crawford family to those who had never heard his name before. Samuel Jackson became a symbol of courage and justice not because he immediately triumphed over the Crawford family, but because he had the guts to stand up. Daniel, Lydia, and Nathan knew that the battle against the Crawford family wouldn't be easy. They understood that expensive lawyers and financial pressure would soon come crashing down on them, like a 10-foot tidal wave ready to drown them. But deep down, Samuel's message resonated within them. History can be twisted, but truth and justice will always find a way to prevail, no matter how long it takes. Silverstone Bank is no longer just a building on 20th Street. It's the place where a 95-year-old man has inspired hope in dozens of people, and where a community has begun to believe that justice, even if delayed, is worth fighting for. Samuel Jackson may have waited his entire life for this day, but when it finally arrived, he left behind a legacy that transcended himself, a lesson that perseverance, truth, and courage can change a world one step at a time. Thank you for joining us on the emotional journey of Samuel Jackson at Silverstone Bank, a 75-year-old man who never gave up in his quest for the truth. If you're moved by his perseverance and indomitable spirit, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the Legendary Narratives channel so you won't miss out on inspiring stories like this one. We've learned that justice may come late, but it's always worth fighting for. A powerful message from Samuel, Daniel, Lydia, and Nathan. You are the greatest motivation for us to share these life-changing stories. Goodbye for now, filled with inspiration, and we'll see you in the next video.